The day I buried my wife, I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, my own son walked into my house, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "Dad, we are selling the house. You should start packing." What he did not know was that his mother had left me something worth far more than the house he wanted to sell. My name is Walter Hayes, and I am 71 years old. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood beside my wife Margaret's grave, watching the last handful of soil fall onto the place where I had promised to love her forever. That morning I returned home alone. I pushed the front door open with my right hand, stepped inside with my left foot, and slowly closed the door behind me. I placed my keys on the small wooden table near the entrance and stood there for several seconds, listening to the silence. Margaret's favorite chair was still beside the window. Her reading glasses were still resting on the table. I walked over, picked them up with my right hand, and held them against my chest. I missed her so badly that even breathing felt difficult. I had not told anyone about the final letter she gave me before she died. Inside that letter was a secret I had promised to protect until the right moment. Margaret had left me a 400-acre ranch in Wyoming, along with the property documents and a private bank account connected to it. My son David knew nothing about the ranch. He believed his mother had left us only this old house and a few savings. I intended to keep the ranch private because I wanted to see what my son truly cared about. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard a car stop outside. I placed my coffee cup down, pushed my chair backward, and slowly stood up. I walked toward the window and moved the curtain aside with 2 fingers. David stepped out of his car. He walked to the front door and knocked twice. I opened it, and before I could say anything, he looked past me into the house and said, "Dad, we are selling this place. You need to move out." I stared at my son, then quietly smiled. He had no idea that his mother had already made sure I had somewhere else to go. I looked at David for a few seconds without saying anything. My son stepped inside as if the house already belonged to him, walked past me, and placed a folder on the dining table. I slowly closed the front door with my right hand, turned the lock, and followed him into the room. "What is that?" I asked. David pulled out several papers and spread them across the table. "The house is worth a lot of money, Dad. Mom is gone, and there is no reason for you to stay here alone. We can sell it and split everything properly." Looked down at the papers and noticed that some of them already had his name written on them. My stomach tightened. "You prepared these before talking to me?" I asked. David avoided my eyes and said, "I knew you would make this difficult." I slowly pulled out the chair closest to me, sat down, and rested both hands on the table. I remembered Margaret telling me something months before her death. "Walter, when I am gone, do not tell David about everything immediately. Watch what he does when he thinks there is nothing left to gain." At the time, I did not understand why she had said it. Now I did. David walked around the kitchen, opened one of the cabinets, and began looking through the drawers as if he were already searching for valuables. "Where are Mom's jewelry and important documents?" he asked. I stood up slowly and watched him. "Why do you need them?" He turned toward me and said, "Because I am handling everything now." Those words hurt more than I expected. His mother had barely been gone 3 weeks, and he was already talking about what belonged to him. I walked toward the hallway, stopped beside Margaret's old writing desk, and placed my hand on the drawer where she had kept the letter about the ranch. David followed me. "What is in there?" he asked. I looked at him and calmly closed the drawer. "Nothing that concerns you." His face changed immediately. He stepped closer and said, "Dad, I am your son. Everything Mom left belongs to this family." I almost laughed, because he had no idea how wrong he was. Margaret had not only left me the Wyoming ranch, she had left very specific instructions about what I should do if David ever tried to take this house from me. That evening, after David finally left, I locked the front door, walked back to Margaret's desk, sat down in her chair, and carefully opened the hidden compartment beneath the bottom drawer. Inside was the original ranch deed, a small brass key, and another envelope with my name written across the front. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The moment I saw the first sentence, I realized Margaret had known exactly what David would do. Walter, if our son ever tries to take your home after my funeral, give him nothing until he learns what I left you in Wyoming. I read Margaret's letter twice before I could fully understand what she was trying to tell me. I slowly unfolded the paper with both hands, placed it flat on the desk, and moved my reading glasses closer to my eyes. Her handwriting was familiar, slightly uneven from the illness that had weakened her near the end. She had written that the Wyoming ranch was not simply a piece of land. It was something she and I had dreamed about for years, something she had secretly purchased, using money she had inherited from her parents. She wanted me to have it because she knew I had always wanted a quiet place where I could spend my later years away from family, arguments, and pressure. But then I reached the part that made me stop reading. Margaret had written that David had asked her several times about her finances before she died. He had wanted to know exactly what she owned, what was in her accounts, and whether she had made a will. She had never told him about the ranch because she had become concerned about his questions. I slowly lowered the letter onto the desk and leaned back in Margaret's chair. My right hand moved over the wooden armrest, and for a moment I could almost imagine her sitting there beside me. Then I noticed the small brass key she had left inside the hidden compartment. I picked it up between my thumb and index finger and turned it slowly under the lamp. A tiny number was engraved on it, 417. I had no idea what it opened. The next morning I packed a small suitcase. I folded 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, my old brown jacket, and a photograph of Margaret that I placed carefully inside the front pocket. Before leaving, I walked through every room of the house, touching small things that reminded me of her. Then I stopped at the front door, placed my right hand on the handle, and looked back one last time. I knew David expected me to stay frightened and confused. Instead, I decided to visit the ranch. After several hours of driving, the landscape began to change. The roads became quieter, the fields wider, and the mountains appeared in the distance. When I finally reached the ranch entrance, I stopped the car and stepped outside. I closed the door behind me, placed both feet firmly on the ground, and looked across hundreds of acres of open land. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt peace. Then I noticed an old wooden building near the far end of the property. I walked toward it slowly, holding the brass key tightly in my right hand. As I reached the door, I saw the same number carved into the wood, 417. I inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock click open. What I found inside made me realize Margaret had left me far more than a ranch. I pushed the wooden door open with my right hand and stepped inside, placing my left foot carefully over the worn threshold. The room smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. I reached toward the wall with my left hand and found a light switch. When the bulb flickered on, I froze. The small building was not an empty storage shed. It was an office. There was a wooden desk in the center, several locked filing cabinets along the wall, and a large map of Wyoming hanging behind the desk. I walked slowly toward it, running my fingers over the edge of the desk as memories of Margaret came rushing back. She had never mentioned this place. I pulled the chair away from the desk, sat down, and noticed a thick envelope lying directly in front of me. My name was written across it in Margaret's handwriting. I opened it carefully and pulled out the first document. It was a property valuation. I read the number once, then read it again. The ranch was worth considerably more than I had imagined. But the next document made me even more confused. It showed several mineral rights connected to the land, along with a list of companies that had been leasing parts of the property for years. I slowly leaned back in the chair. Margaret had apparently been receiving payments from those companies without ever telling David or anyone else in the family. Then I found a bank statement showing that the ranch had generated millions of dollars over the years. I placed the paper on the desk and stared at it in silence. Margaret had not simply left me land. She had left me a fortune. But then I noticed a second envelope underneath the bank records. This one was marked, "Do not open until David tries to take the house." My hands began to tremble. I opened it immediately. Inside was a letter that explained why Margaret had kept everything secret. She wrote that she had become suspicious of David after he started asking about her estate and repeatedly pressured her to change certain parts of her will. She had even discovered that he had contacted a real estate agent about selling our house while she was still alive. I slowly stood up from the chair. pushed it backward with my right hand, and walked toward the window. Outside, the Wyoming wind was moving through the tall grass. I pressed my palm against the glass and whispered, "Margaret, what were you protecting me from?" Then I heard something behind me. I turned around slowly. The door I had left open was now closed. I took one careful step toward it, then another. As I reached for the handle, I heard a man's voice from the other side. "Mr. Hayes, your wife told me you would eventually come here." I stood completely still when I heard the man's voice on the other side of the door. I slowly lowered my hand from the handle and turned my head toward the sound. "Who are you?" I asked. For a few seconds, there was no answer. Then the door opened slightly and an older man stepped inside. He wore a faded brown jacket, dusty boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. He removed the hat with his right hand and held it against his chest. "My name is Samuel," he said. "Your wife knew me for almost 20 years. I stared at him, trying to remember his face. He walked toward the desk, stopped a few feet away, and looked at the documents scattered across it. "Margaret told me that if you ever came here after her funeral, I was supposed to tell you everything." I slowly pulled the chair away from the desk and sat down. Samuel remained standing. He told me that he had managed the ranch for Margaret for years. She had purchased the property quietly because she wanted a place where we could eventually retire. But there was something else she had never told me. The mineral rights beneath the ranch were far more valuable than the land itself. Several energy companies had been paying Margaret for access, and she had kept those contracts private. Samuel reached into his jacket, pulled out a small black folder, and placed it on the desk in front of me. I opened it carefully. Inside were contracts showing that the ranch was generating millions of dollars every year. My mouth went dry. "Why did she hide this from me?" I asked. Samuel looked at me for several seconds before answering. "Because she was afraid someone would take it from you." I immediately thought about David. Samuel nodded before I even said his name. He told me that Margaret had received several calls from David before she died, asking about the ranch and her estate. She had become convinced that David had somehow discovered the property existed. Then Samuel reached into the folder and pulled out a printed email. He placed it in front of me and pointed to the sender's name. It was David. The message had been sent to a real estate attorney 6 months before Margaret's death. I read the first sentence and felt my stomach tighten. I need to know exactly what my mother owns before she changes her mind. I slowly placed the paper back on the desk. Samuel leaned forward and quietly said, "Mr. Hayes, your wife did not just leave you this ranch. She left you a test." Then he handed me another document. At the bottom was Margaret's signature, followed by one sentence. "If David tries to take Walter's home, give Walter the second key." I stared at the sentence at the bottom of Margaret's document and slowly ran my right index finger across her signature. "If David tries to take Walter's home, give Walter the second key." I looked up at Samuel and asked, "Where is the second key?" Samuel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a small silver key, and placed it gently on the desk. I picked it up between my thumb and forefinger and turned it under the light. Unlike the first brass key, this one had no number engraved on it. "What does it open?" I asked. Samuel pointed toward the back wall of the office. I stood, pushed the chair aside with my left hand, and walked toward the wall. He followed me and stopped beside an old wooden cabinet. Samuel opened the cabinet and moved several dusty folders out of the way. Behind them was a small metal door built into the wall. I inserted the silver key and slowly turned it. There was a heavy click. I pulled the door toward me and inside was a black metal box. I lifted it carefully with both hands and placed it on the desk. Samuel told me Margaret had specifically instructed him never to open it. I found a small latch, lifted it, and opened the box. Inside were photographs, legal documents, account statements, and a sealed envelope with my name written across it. I picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Margaret's handwriting filled the first page. She explained that she had discovered David was secretly trying to gain control of our home and some of our finances. She had also learned that he had spoken to a lawyer about challenging her will after her death. My hands began to shake. Then I reached the final page. Margaret had written that if David ever tried to force me out of our home, I should not fight him immediately. Instead, I was supposed to come to the ranch and open this box. I looked at Samuel and asked why. He pointed toward a stack of documents. Because those documents prove something about your son that he does not want you to know. I picked up the first folder and opened it. Inside were copies of bank transfers from an account I had never seen before. The payments had been made to David over several years. But there was one name appearing repeatedly beside the transfers. It belonged to the same attorney David had contacted about selling our house. I slowly lowered the papers onto the desk. Then Samuel said, "Mr. Hayes, your wife believed your son was not just trying to take your home. She believed he was planning to take everything you had." I stared at Samuel, unable to understand what he meant. I slowly picked up the bank statements with both hands and spread them across the desk. The numbers showed that David had received repeated payments from accounts connected to the ranch, but I had never authorized any of them. I looked at the dates and recognized several of them immediately. They were from years when Margaret and I had been struggling financially. I remembered telling her that we needed to cut back on expenses. Yet somehow David had been receiving money at the same time. I turned toward Samuel and asked, "Why would Margaret give him money without telling me?" Samuel shook his head. "She did not give it to him willingly." My fingers tightened around the papers. He explained that David had convinced Margaret that he was investing the money for the family. He promised that he would return everything once his business became successful. But when Margaret started asking for records, David became angry and stopped answering her calls. Samuel reached into the box and pulled out several copies of emails between Margaret and David. I sat down again, placed the papers on the desk, and began reading them one by one. Margaret had repeatedly asked David where the money had gone. His replies became shorter and more aggressive. In one message, he told her to stop asking questions because she would regret making things difficult. I felt a sharp pain in my chest when I read those words. That was not the son I remembered from childhood. Samuel then showed me another document. It was a property search report, showing that David had recently attempted to place a claim against our home. My eyes widened. "He cannot do that," I said. Samuel looked at me and replied, "He already tried." I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the grass, bending it in long waves. I placed my palm against the glass and thought about Margaret. She had known something was wrong long before I did. Then my phone began vibrating in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw David's name on the screen. I answered but said nothing. His voice came through immediately. "Dad, where are you?" I looked at Samuel, then at the documents on the desk. "Why?" I asked. David hesitated. Then he said, "Because I went back to your house, and I found something Mom left behind." My heart started beating faster. I asked what he had found. There was a long silence before he finally said, "The letter about Wyoming." The moment David said he had found the letter about Wyoming, I felt my stomach tighten. I slowly stood beside the desk, placed my left hand against its edge and looked at Samuel. He immediately understood that something had changed. "What did you do with the letter?" I asked David. He did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Dad, you should come home. We need to talk about Mom's things." His voice sounded calm, but I could hear the tension underneath it. I told him I would be home soon and ended the call. Then I placed my phone on the desk and took a slow breath. Samuel stepped closer and asked if I wanted him to come with me. I nodded. We locked the office, stepped outside, and walked toward my truck. I opened the driver's door with my right hand, placed my left foot inside, then lowered myself into the seat. Samuel climbed into the passenger side and we began the long drive back. Neither of us spoke for the first hour. I kept thinking about the letter. Margaret had specifically warned me to keep the ranch secret. Yet somehow David had found it. When we finally reached my town, I noticed David's car parked outside my house. I slowed the truck, pulled into the driveway, and switched off the engine. Samuel looked at me and said, "Do not tell him anything about what we found." I nodded, opened my door, and stepped onto the driveway. I walked toward the front door and noticed that it was slightly open. My heart started pounding. I pushed it open with my right hand and stepped inside. The house looked exactly as I had left it, but several drawers were open and papers were scattered across the floor. Someone had clearly been searching through Margaret's belongings. I walked into the living room and found David standing beside her desk. He was holding the letter. I stopped several feet away from him. Why were you going through her private things? I asked. David looked at me and said, Because I am your son, and I deserve to know what Mom left behind. I slowly stepped closer and held out my hand. Give me the letter. Instead of handing it over, David smiled. I already read it. Then he lifted another document from the desk and said, And now I know about the ranch. My heart sank. But David did not know that I had already discovered the hidden accounts, the secret payments, and Margaret's warnings. He thought he had found my biggest secret. He had no idea that I had already found his. I looked at David standing beside Margaret's desk, holding the letter in his right hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I slowly walked toward him, stopped a few feet away, and held out my hand. David, give me the letter. He looked at the paper, then back at me and smiled. Why did Mom hide a 400-acre ranch from me, Dad? I kept my face calm. Because it was hers to leave to her. Whoever she wanted. David's expression hardened. He stepped around the desk and placed the letter inside his jacket. You cannot keep something this valuable from me. I took one slow breath and asked, Is that why you were searching through her desk? He avoided my eyes. I moved closer, placed my left hand on the back of the chair, and said, You were not looking for memories. You were looking for something you could take. David became angry and accused me of being selfish. He said Mom would never have wanted me to keep millions of dollars while her own son struggled. I almost laughed because I knew about the money he had already taken. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the photographs of the bank statement Samuel had given me. I turned the screen toward him, then explained these. David looked at the screen and froze. His face changed immediately. He took one step backward and asked where I had found them. I told him it did not matter. What mattered was that I knew he had been receiving money from accounts connected to the ranch. He started speaking quickly, claiming the payments were gifts from Mom. I shook my head and told him Margaret had kept records of everything. Then I placed a copy of the property claim on the desk. And this is your attempt to put a claim on my house. David stared at the document. Without saying anything, Samuel stepped into the room behind me, and David suddenly looked frightened. He had never expected anyone else to know what Margaret had discovered. I looked directly at my son and said, Your mother spent her final months protecting me from you. David's jaw tightened. Then he slowly reached into his jacket, pulled out Margaret's letter and placed it on the desk. Fine, he said, but you still do not know the whole truth. I frowned. David leaned closer and whispered, Mom did not buy that ranch with her own money. She bought it with money that was supposed to belong to me. David's accusation left me staring at him in silence. I slowly pulled the chair away from the desk and sat down, keeping my eyes fixed on my son. What money are you talking about? I asked. David crossed his arms and said that his grandfather had supposedly promised him a large inheritance years ago, and that Margaret had taken that money and used it to buy the Wyoming ranch. I listened carefully, then reached for the folder Samuel had brought from the ranch. I opened it with both hands and removed the oldest financial documents. The first page showed the original purchase of the ranch. I placed it on the desk and pointed to the account used for the payment. This account belonged to your mother, I said. David shook his head and insisted that the money was meant for him. I asked him why he had never mentioned this before. He became quiet. I turned another page and showed him the bank records, proving that Margaret had purchased the ranch, using money she had inherited from her own parents. David stepped closer, picked up the document, and stared at it. His face slowly changed. That cannot be right, he whispered. I stood up, walked toward the window, and looked outside at the quiet street. Then I remembered another part of Margaret's letter. She had written that David had repeatedly invented stories about inheritances and family money whenever he wanted access to her accounts. I turned around and told him the truth. The ranch had never belonged to him. Margaret had bought it legally, paid every expense herself, and left it to me through her will. David became furious. He slammed his hand against the desk and demanded that I give him half of the ranch. I took one step backward and calmly told him that he was not entitled to anything. Samuel moved beside me and quietly said, David, your mother documented every payment because she knew you would eventually make this claim. David looked at him with anger. Then his eyes moved toward the folder. "What else did she write?" he asked. I picked up the final sealed envelope Margaret had left for me. I held it in my right hand and looked at David. "This is the last thing your mother wanted me to read." I opened the envelope slowly, unfolded the letter, and began reading. The first line made my heart sink. "Walter, if David tells you the ranch was supposed to be his, do not believe him. There is something he has never told you about the money he took from us." I read Margaret's words slowly, my eyes moving from one line to the next while David stood across the room watching me. I reached the bottom of the page and stopped. Margaret had written that David had secretly borrowed a large amount of money from her years earlier, claiming he needed it to save his business. She had trusted him because he was her son, but instead of using the money for his business, David had transferred part of it into a private investment account and used the rest to pay personal debts. When Margaret discovered the truth, she demanded that he return everything. David promised he would, but he never did. I slowly lowered the letter onto the desk and looked at my son. "Is this true?" I asked. David looked away. I stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped directly in front of him. "Look at me, David." He finally raised his eyes. His face was pale. "I was going to pay her back," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You had years to do it," he began explaining, that his business had failed and that he had been afraid to tell us. I listened without interrupting, but then I remembered the documents showing that he had recently tried to claim our house. I asked him why he needed even more money after already taking so much from his mother. He did not answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened a message and placed the screen in front of me. It was from a real estate attorney. The message said that if David could prove he had an interest in Margaret's estate, he might be able to challenge the ranch ownership. My stomach tightened. David had not come to the house because he was grieving. He had come because he wanted the ranch. I slowly handed the phone back to him and told him that the ranch belonged to me legally and that I would defend it. David's expression suddenly changed from anger to desperation. He stepped closer and said, "Dad, you do not understand. I owe people money." I asked him how much. He swallowed hard and whispered, "More than the ranch is worth." Then he told me something that made me realize why he had been so determined to get Margaret's property. He had already signed an agreement promising the ranch to someone else. He had never owned it, yet he had promised to sell it. I stared at him in disbelief. "Who did you promise it to?" I asked. David looked toward the floor and whispered, "The people who are coming here tomorrow." David's words made the room feel suddenly smaller. I slowly placed Margaret's letter back on the desk and looked at my son. "What do you mean, the people who are coming tomorrow?" I asked. David rubbed both hands over his face and lowered himself into the chair. He finally admitted that he had borrowed money from several private lenders and had told them that he would soon receive part of Margaret's estate. When they demanded proof, he had shown them documents that made it appear as if he had an interest in the Wyoming ranch. I stood beside the desk, gripping the edge with my right hand, trying to control my anger. "You promised someone property that never belonged to you?" I asked. David nodded without looking at me. Samuel stepped forward and asked how much money David owed. David whispered a number so large that I had to ask him to repeat it. I stared at him in disbelief. He had created debts that could destroy everything he had built, and now he expected me to save him with a property he had never owned. I told him I would not give him the ranch, but I also did not want anyone coming to my home and threatening my family. Samuel immediately called his attorney and explained the situation. Within an hour, we had copies of the documents David had shown the lenders. The attorney examined them carefully and told us that some of the paperwork appeared to have been altered. My eyes moved toward David. "Did you change these documents?" I asked. He shook his head at first, but then he lowered his eyes and admitted that he had changed the wording on one page to make it look like Margaret had promised him part of the ranch. I felt deeply disappointed. I walked toward the window, placed my right hand against the glass, and looked out at the darkening sky. I remembered Margaret's final warning. She had known David might do something desperate after her death. Then my phone rang. It was the attorney. He told me that someone had just contacted him claiming to represent the lenders and demanding immediate access to the Wyoming ranch. I asked what they wanted. He replied that they believed David had already sold them the property. I turned slowly toward my son. "David, what have you done?" He stood up, his face pale, and whispered, "Dad, they are not coming tomorrow anymore. They are already on their way." I looked at David and felt a coldness settle in my chest. I slowly reached for my phone with my right hand and called the sheriff's office while Samuel moved toward the front window to see if anyone was approaching. I told the sheriff that several people might be heading toward my property because of a fraudulent agreement involving land that legally belonged to me. After ending the call, I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers. In the distance, headlights appeared at the end of the road. 1 vehicle became 2, then 3. David stood behind me, breathing heavily. "Dad, I am sorry," he whispered. I turned around and looked directly at him. "Sorry will not undo what you have done." Stepped away from the window and walked back to Margaret's desk, where her final documents were still spread across the surface. I picked up the original ranch deed and held it firmly in my right hand. Samuel told me that the original deed, Margaret's will, and the mineral rights contracts proved the ranch belonged to me. Then the vehicle stopped outside. I heard doors opening and footsteps approaching the house. I slowly walked toward the front door, placed my right hand on the handle, and looked at David. "Stay behind me." I opened the door, and 3 men stood on the porch. The man in front introduced himself and said he represented the people David owed money to. He demanded that I hand over the ranch documents. I told him calmly that David had never owned the ranch and had no legal authority to sell it. The man smiled and said, "Your son told us something very different." I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady, and told him that the sheriff was already on the way. His smile disappeared. A few minutes later, police vehicles arrived, and the men were ordered away from the property. The attorney arrived shortly afterward and reviewed the documents with the officers. The fraudulent agreement was collected as evidence, and David finally admitted that he had created it because he believed he could force me to give him the ranch. I looked at my son and felt more sadness than anger. Margaret had spent her final months trying to protect me from exactly this moment. Later that night, after everyone had left, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened her final letter again. At the bottom, she had written one last sentence: "Walter, the ranch is not your reward. It is your chance to begin again." I folded the letter carefully, pressed it against my chest, and realized that tomorrow I would return to Wyoming, not because I was running away from my old life, but because Margaret had finally shown me where my new life was waiting. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, walked into the kitchen, and stood quietly beside the window while the first light appeared over the rooftops. I made myself a cup of coffee, placed it on the table, and sat down in Margaret's old chair for the last time. I picked up her photograph with my right hand and held it against my chest. "You were right," I whispered. "It is time for me to begin again." A few hours later, I packed my suitcase, folded my clothes carefully, placed Margaret's photograph inside the front pocket, and carried the bag toward the front door. I stopped halfway, turned around, and looked at the house where we had spent so many years together. I could still see her sitting near the window, reading her book, waiting for me to come home. I placed my right hand on the door handle, took one slow breath, and stepped outside. David was waiting beside his car. He looked exhausted, but this time he did not ask me for the ranch or the house. He simply stood there and said, "Dad, I am sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I told him that I loved him because he was my son, but love did not mean allowing someone to destroy everything I had worked for. I told him that if he wanted to rebuild our relationship, he would have to earn my trust again, one honest decision at a time. He nodded, lowered his eyes, and walked away. I placed my suitcase in my truck, closed the door, and drove toward Wyoming. Hours later, I reached the ranch. I stepped out of the truck, placed both feet on the ground, and looked across the wide open land Margaret had secretly chosen for me. The wind moved through the grass. The mountains stood quietly in the distance, and for the first time since her funeral, I did not feel completely alone. I walked toward the old office, unlocked the door, and sat at the desk where I had discovered her secrets. I opened her final letter one more time. At the bottom, Beneath everything she had written, there was a sentence I had not noticed before. Walter, when you finally understand why I gave you this place, you will know that I never left you. I closed my eyes and smiled through my tears. Margaret had not simply left me a ranch. She had left me a place where I could heal, a future I could build, and a reminder that sometimes losing someone does not mean losing everything they gave you. I placed her photograph on the desk, looked out across the ranch, and whispered, "I am home." And that was the day I stopped being the grieving husband who had lost his wife and became the old man she had trusted enough to start over. If this story touched your heart, remember this. People may try to measure your worth by what you own, but the greatest inheritance is the wisdom, love, and courage someone leaves inside you.